Now, I must confess that in planning this series on the gospel and mental health, that I was actually quite wary of including a Sunday on grief as a subject for our reflection together. Grief fits our All Saints Sunday, which is what we're celebrating. And part of my hesitancy was because, to be clear as possible as I can be, grief is not a mental illness or disorder. It's not. Unfortunately, what happens, there are times when people amidst deep grief have friends or maybe family members express concern that maybe they're grieving too long or they're grieving in an unhealthy way. The truth is, all human beings grieve in different ways. They might express worry that the person grieving is becoming depressed. When the reality is, the truth is, and something we all should embrace, the reality is to be human is to grieve. To be human is to grieve. And grief can look like depression in many ways, but more often than not, when people tell you in the midst of your grief they're worried about your mental health, more often than not, it has far more to do with their own discomfort with pain than it does with your own grieving. And part of that is one of the characteristics of our culture is that when you're not happy, there's something wrong with you, right? We operated along the Hakuna Matata philosophy, right? Don't worry, be happy. And if you're not happy, you're doing something wrong. We treat happiness as a goal in life rather than as simply a part of what it means to be human and emotion, just like sadness and sorrow. We treat it in many ways as if that's what we're supposed to be. I thought about it. I think it would be kind of a mental disorder if you were happy all the time, to be truthful. To be human is to feel sadness and sorrow and grief. And if we treat grief as a mental disorder, then we lose an important aspect of what it means to be human. The truth is, it is out of grief that some of the greatest works of art exist. The story we read this morning of Jesus grieving is an expression of his own humanity. Jesus wept. I know our translation had it a little bit differently, but the King James Version or other versions simply have it, Jesus wept. And let me tell you, if you ever have a trivia contest and someone asks you what's the shortest verse in the Bible, now you can say, Jesus wept. It is the shortest verse in the Bible, but it is probably in many ways one of the most profound verses in the Bible. Jesus is on his way to the village where Mary and Martha are grieving and being consoled by their neighbors. And Mary rushes to Jesus and in a very human way expresses what she's feeling. She's angry. Lord, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. To be clear, anger is a very painful part of grief, but it is part of grief. Anger at God, anger at others, anger even at ourselves, even anger towards a loved one who's gone. And I like the very next line in this passage. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit, deeply moved, and Jesus wept. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of this. Recent scientific research has discovered what they call mirror neurons in your brain. Have y'all heard of this before? That actually we are made with these mirror neurons in our brain that enable us and that cause within us an ability to mirror the feelings and behaviors of those around us. In other words, we're made to connect and empathize. Some scientists argue that we are wired to empathetically respond to those around us. We are made to connect to each other. Jesus wept, and there's this interesting line in which the Jews say, "See how he loved him." Now, the point of this is not to say the amount of weeping is a direct result of how much we love the one we've lost. It's not an expression, it's not a contest to see who weeps the loudest or the longest. Again, grief is very human and very much an expression of our own individuality. Everyone grieves in different ways. But it is to say, I think, important enough to affirm that grief is connected to love. It is. The truth is, if you don't love someone, you won't grieve them, will you? If you don't care about someone, you don't grieve. So the cost of love, if it can be called a cost, is grief. But what would it be like to go through life without loving anyone enough that you would grieve their loss? And to me, this is the grace. To be human is to grieve, and grief connects us to each other. Grief is meant to be shared. Grief is meant to be shared in a community. And I know when people in the midst of grief feel like they don't want to be a burden or judged for grieving someone. I know I've talked to members who've lost a loved one, and they're a little bit afraid, and I understand this, that when they come to worship, they might lose it, they might cry, they might weep, because the grief of having their loved one. And I understand that. But the church should be a place, don't you think, in which grief is shared. And you're not judged because you're crying. Crying may not belong in baseball, it belongs in church, right? And it is in sharing our grief that we find the strength to bear it. Now, that's what today is about. There's Darsa was reminding me of a movie before I did this series. Who's here has seen the Disney movie Inside Out? It came out in 2015. Probably my favorite all-time Disney movie. And it tells the story of a young girl, 11-year-old girl named Riley. And it actually, it goes into her mind and illustrates the characters of joy, of sadness, of anger, of disgust and fear in the very funny way in which Disney can do that. In the characterization, they consulted psychologists and others about how to characterize those primary emotions, especially joy and sadness. But one of the interesting things in the movie is that joy is always kind of ignoring sadness. You're such a downer, right? You're no fun to be around. Joy, joy, joy. That's what we need. But this Riley, at age 11, moves with her family from Minnesota to San Francisco and undergoes a crisis, an emotional crisis, in which she feels this profound sadness, this profound grief at everything she's lost in this move. So much so she gets derailed and actually runs away from home. And the movie illustrates this journey in which the character of Joy becomes to realize is that you cannot have joy without sadness. That you cannot experience the true depths of being human without the mixture of those two feelings. And it is when they finally reconcile that Riley begins to realize she's not alone. That in fact, the healing moment for her is when she finally goes to her parents and says to them, expresses her deep grief at the loss she experienced. And to her surprise, her parents shared their grief too. And her healing only begins when that grief is shared.